So, after epically failing in the closed northeastern primaries, Sanders has unexpectedly rebounded and done a little better than I thought plausible in a few places. Indiana, Kentucky, and West Virginia. Does that mean Sanders has a chance after all? Well, we have some more data to play with. I'm going to do a little update. Let's go back to June 5th. A few weeks ago, I would have suggested that Puerto Rico should favor Clinton because it's offshore. Since then, we've seen that logic fail to pan out. We've also learned that Clinton doesn't really have any meaningful advantage with Hispanics, except in closed primaries, which is more of a reflection on class than on language. So we have open primaries, like in Illinois. Um, the Hispanic vote, it's not exactly 50-50. It tends to be like 55-45, something like that, right? I believe there were a few states where it's thought the Sanders claims they won Hispanics in Nevada, um, but when you have closed primaries, um, the advantage does come out, and it's just what that actually is. And I went over this with the black vote as well. What it really suggests is that poor Hispanics are not registered to vote, right? That if you look at if you look at Hispanics that are registered, they're overwhelmingly wealthy, and so they overwhelmingly skew towards Clinton. And it's the same thing with blacks. If you look at the blacks that are registered to vote in closed primaries, I mean, who are they? They're older people, they're wealthy people, they're educated people. The kind of mass of desperate colored folk in the United States. Um, I'm speaking in vague generalities. I'm doing it on purpose to kind of get the point across. Uh, the, the the people that you would expect would lean heavily towards Sanders, in fact, are. It's just like they can't vote, right? Um, or at least when they do vote, and that's what we're seeing come out, right? Um, I'm actually my battery. I'm gonna swap this. I'll be back in a second. So I mean, if your logic is Puerto Rico is full of Hispanics, therefore that should benefit Clinton, that's not good logic. It doesn't mean she won't win anyways, um, but that data is not there. The data that we have is that Hispanics that are wealthy, that are older, um, and etc., um, are very heavily backing Clinton, just like older and wealthy people are broadly backing Clinton. Um, and Puerto Rico doesn't fit that pattern, right? In fact, Puerto Rico is an open primary, and it doesn't have the wealthy, educated, and older Hispanic voters that have backed Clinton in places like Florida. Which is not to say that there aren't any, wealthy, educated, older Hispanic people in Puerto Rico. It's just to say that it's not. I'm talking about proportions, right? I'm not talking about absolute levels, right? So Sanders really ought to be given a fighting chance in Puerto Rico because it's an overwhelmingly poor place, and Sanders tends to do well with lower income Hispanics actually. So us be a little more optimistic than we should be and say he can win 60%. Um, he did very well in Hawaii. That might be the better metric, and 60, he might even do a little better than that. But let's say Sanders plus 12. Okay. Some people now. What about California? Well, some people are making note of the fact that Oregon wasn't a blowout. But the more important thing to pull out is that it's actually the first closed primary that Sanders had won in the whole process, right? So yeah, Sanders only got 55% of the vote in Oregon, but they were all Democrats. There were no independents in Oregon. Washington was an open caucus. A lot of the places around there were open caucuses, right? Um, if it was an open primary, you might have seen the numbers that you saw elsewhere, in the 70s, right? Now let's be a little let's say that independents in California can hit 30% of the vote and Sanders can win 75% of them. It's not unreasonable. He does that, right? Then assuming that Democrats vote the same way that he did in Oregon, you get the following percentage of voters for Sanders. You know, 70% of the sorry, the 70% of the voters are Democrats, and there's 55% of them. So you multiply that together, and then you'd add, 30% of the voters are independents, and 75% of them are going to vote for Sanders. So you multiply that together, and then you add them together, you get 61%, right? So a big win is really perfectly reasonable. Well, let's be a little optimistic. Let's say the state erupts and you get independents at 40% of the vote, and he was 80% of them. Well, if you do the math there, then it comes to 65%. So we see diminishing returns, right? He'd have to get that number. If he wants to get, a really win a really big win, he'd have to increase the number of Democrats that are going to vote for him, which is maybe a little. Um, I think that if he can get 55% of Democrats against Hillary Clinton in California, he's doing very, very well, right? So we see diminishing returns there, but let's take that 65% as a less than absurd possibility, right? Let's say he gets it. He may even do better, right? The polling in that, I know the polling isn't really saying that, but the polls in Indiana were very wrong. The polls in Oregon, well, there was one poll, right? Like we haven't had a lot of really rigorous polling in California, right? You do one poll from, you know, last week. It's not good, right? You can't really draw any conclusions from that, right? So let's not pretend that we can. I know the media narrative right now is he's losing in California. There has not been any polling in California. You can't really actually say that, right? And if you're going to ask me what's more reliable, one poll in California from last week or the primary results in Oregon from last week, I'm going to look at the primary results. I'm not going to look at the one poll that was done, under not so good circumstances, right? And you see that result in Oregon, you see that result in Indiana. Now, last week I said, let's have a reality check here. There's only been one poll in Oregon, and Clinton was ahead by 20 points, or I think it was 15, which is reasonable. But I didn't really expand on that or suggest it was that important, right? I just pointed out that there really is no polling evidence of him winning in Oregon, and right now there is no polling evidence of him winning in California, but there's not a lot of polling, so there's no polling evidence of him losing in California either, right? But let's say he pulls it off and he has a big win in California. Well, then we're looking at about plus 155 right now. How about New Jersey? Well, New Jersey also allows independents to vote, so the closest thing to it that we can base information on would have to be Rhode Island, where Sanders got to 55%. I know you want to say, well, New Jersey is basically the same as New York, but New York was a closed primary, and New Jersey is an open primary. So it's a very bad comparison, right? You might want to say it's the same as Delaware. Delaware is a closed primary, right? Or Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a closed primary. The only open primary in that neighborhood was in Rhode Island. Now, Rhode Island's a little wealthier, which in some way may help Sanders because Sanders tends to do better with the postgraduates, right? Like the very educated. It's funny, right? Clinton does better with people with like bachelor's degrees or master's degrees, but Sanders does better with the very poor and the very, very educated, which I don't want. There's no reason to get into this right now, but that's actually reflective of the way capitalism operates, right? Where you have sort of the new middle class is the people with bachelor's degrees, and they just want money, 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 right? Just driven by sort of the profit margin. The truth is, it's not that hard to get a bachelor's degree nowadays, and those cats ain't so smart necessarily, right? So you've got that kind of, society has built you in a way. You get, sort of the minimum level of education that's acceptable in today's society. We really shouldn't be talking about people with bachelor's degrees as educated people. We should be talking about, like, the bachelor's degree is a new high school degree, right? But once you get beyond that, you get the real smart kids. They are able to see beyond the sort of the blinders of neoliberalism, and they actually mostly support, like, the people with postgraduate degrees, doctorates. They actually line up very strongly behind Sanders, right? I'm not suggesting that Rhode Island has an exceedingly high number of people with postgraduates, but it's a wealthy place, relatively speaking, right? Um, but the flip side of that is that, so I mean, you wouldn't expect Rhode Island to have the same kind of poor voters that New Jersey has, right? But because that middle spot that isn't going to be as represented there, right? You've got the poor and the rich in Rhode Island. Um, so it it's not. I don't think that the kind of straight Rhode Island is wealthier, therefore Sanders should do more. Therefore Sanders should do better. I don't think that Sanders should necessarily do better in Jersey because Rhode Island is more wealthy, right? That's what I'm trying to get across. Because the wealthy in Rhode Island are going to be mostly elite, right? Um, and they have actually been backing Sanders. Um, like when I mean elite, I mean elite education. So I'm talking like doctors and that kind of thing, right? Um, but New Jersey's been hit hard by deindustrialization too, and that's probably more important. Okay, I think that it's not at all outside the realm of possibility that Sanders can do very well in New Jersey. Um, Again, you can point to the polls. You can say, "Geez, he's not winning the polls." Well, I think that there haven't really been a lot of polls, um, and it's kind of the same thing as with California, right, and with Oregon. There's not really polling support to suggest that he's winning. There's not really polling support to suggest that he's losing either. There just have not been enough polls, and they haven't been good enough. And I know that the Monmouth polls, I would strongly suggest that the Monmouth polls are following the closed primary model, right? If New Jersey was a closed primary, there would be little question that Clinton would win, and probably by a substantial margin, right? But it's not. So let's be optimistic. Let's say he can get 60% there, all right? So that's Sanders plus 26, and we're up to 181 for Sanders. Big last day. But Montana and the Dakotas, well, he did well in the surrounding states, so why not project 75%? That would give Sanders another 29. So we're up to 210 for Sanders. But on June 7th, and what is it, the 9th? It's a couple of days after June 7th, DC votes. But New Mexico also votes on June 7th. And these are both closed primaries. And unfortunately, the data is pretty clear about what happens to Sanders in closed primaries everywhere except the most progressive state in the country. Now, you can look at it the other way. I think that if you were to, and I haven't, let's remember that I'm not actually doing any math here. I'm just, looking at things and saying, okay, this, right? Because I can do that, right? I don't actually have to do the math. I can just look at it and, say that, right? You can accuse me of some hand waving here, and I'll take it. But I mean, I'm not publishing something. I'm ranting on a vlog, right? So these are off the cuff comments, but I think that it would be pretty clear that if you were to graph Sanders's performance in closed primaries from February to today, he would be doing better and better and better. And then you would look at the chart, and then you would see, geez, he actually won in Oregon. Might that suggest he has a better chance in New Mexico because he's been doing better and better in these closed primaries, and then he finally won? Maybe the win in Oregon might suggest he can win in New Mexico. Well, maybe. Maybe it'll be closer than we have reason to predict. But we have to remember that Oregon is probably a little bit of an outlier, and that while it may be true that he may have lost in Oregon if the vote was in February, it's maybe being a little too generous to suggest that his win in Oregon suggests he can win in New Mexico. But I will say again that if he does win in New Mexico, Clinton should be be very concerned. Okay, so these are both close primaries. Excuse me, and the data is pretty clear about what happens to Sanders in close primaries everywhere except the most progressive state in the country. I previously suggested that Sanders has to win D.C. as a statement on his ability to win liberal blacks. And if he does win D.C., and he does get support from liberal blacks, well, that's gonna put Clinton in a bit of a quandary moving into the primary. But the close primary rules have demonstrated themselves far too restrictive to even contemplate it. Okay, if she loses a close primary in D.C., she should conclude her coalition has completely evaporated and immediately withdraw. You can predict the election. Well, she won't necessarily win if she wins D.C. You should expect her to win D.C. But if she loses D.C., she will lose the election. Okay. So, but let's be realistic here. Clinton will probably make up somewhere around 20 delegates from New Mexico and D.C. So you can take Sanders' big win down a little, right? The chances of him sweeping are nil, right? So let's round it down to Sanders plus 75. The current difference is around Clinton plus 275. So in this very optimistic scenario, he can close the gap to about 100. Let's say it's even under 100, 90, 80, something like that. That's his best case scenario at this point, is to cut the delegate lead to under 100. And the reason is because of the primaries on the 26th. That was the nail, right? So does he have any chance of winning? Not by the pledged delegate count, no. But let's say he actually pulls that off and keeps her under 100 in pledged delegates. Okay? Say it's around 2.5%, right? So you're looking at a 52-48 win. $51.49. Is that really a win for Clinton? If she can't win independence anywhere? If she gets hammered on the last day? With no momentum at all? Okay, where do you draw the line and say that this is a draw? I can tell you where you draw that line, and it's what the Sanders campaign has been saying. In order to win, you have to get to the minimum delegate count with pledged delegates. It's like 2,300. That's a win. It's a clear win. It's a clear expression of the popular will. And if neither candidate gets there, that's a draw, right? And so I think that the more realistic way to look at the convention that's coming up is not that Clinton has won and it's over. It's that it's a tie. The primary was a tie. And now they need to walk into the convention and determine tie-breaking procedures. Which is what nobody is saying. But that's that's the correct analysis, right? 100 delegates is a margin of error. They're tied, okay? And when you look at the rules and all the things that happened, it's reasonable to come to that conclusion, right? But nobody is saying that, including the Democratic Party itself, okay? The Democratic Party has broadcast its plans pretty clearly. His chances of getting that nomination are not slim, they're infinitesimal, okay? It may be the case that the objectively correct analysis of the outcome of the primary process is that it was a tie. That doesn't mean that the Democratic Party is going to take that position, and it's pretty clear that they're not going to. Okay? But he does still have the opportunity to make them look very, very stupid in making the wrong choice. He's not going to win, but he can prove that they're making the wrong choice. They're cutting off their collective noses despite their collective faces. And Cruz, in the end, may be right about something after all. Okay? Those responsible for Trump's victory, and the people responsible for Trump's victory, if Trump does win, may end up being Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Hillary Clinton, and all of the people around her that are pushing her into the slot, despite all evidence suggesting that that's a wrong decision. Okay? Those people that are making this error will be judged very harshly. Very harshly.